Hello. Hello. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Edgar Allan Poe Museum, both to those of you just arriving and to everyone. Welcome to the Poe Shrine. I'd like to say something about where we are right now. Let me start by talking about the garden itself, actually. The garden is called the Enchanted Garden, and that phrase is found in one of Poe's poems. And the whole garden, including where we are right now, was landscaped with Poe's poetry in mind. The founders of this museum in the 1920s read through Poe's poems, maybe not Ulalume, but they read through many of his other poems, and they paid special attention to one poem in particular. It's called 2-1 in Paradise, and it's 2-1 in Paradise is found within one of Poe's stories. He did this several times in his career. He wrote a poem and then embedded it within one of his stories. In this case, 2-1 in Paradise is within a story called The Assignation. And there's also The Fall of the House of Usher, which contains the Haunted Palace, and Ligeia, which contains the Conqueror Worm. But 2-1 in Paradise is a lovely poem if you don't remember that it's within a story about a suicide pact and the murder of a child. But the first few lines of the poem are, "Thou wast that all to me, love, for which my soul did pine. A green isle in the sea, love, a fountain and shrine, all wreathed with fairy fruits and flowers, and all flowers were mine." So with a little imagination, you'd see the green isle out here, and that's the fountain right there, and we are in the shrine. This shrine was built using bricks from the Southern Literary Messenger, which was where Poe had his first job on the staff of a literary magazine. The Southern Literary Messenger was 4 blocks away from here at 15th and Main Streets. And Poe worked there from the fall of 1835 until very early 1837. The building was still there in the 19-teens, but the city had slated it for demolition. The city was planning to expand 15th Street, and instead, and it wanted to demolish that building. In order to do that, they demolished it, and then they expanded 14th Street instead. So the demolition was sort of pointless, but the eventual founders of this museum tried to stop the demolition. They failed, so there was a pile of bricks on the corner of 15th and Main for a few years. The founders brought those bricks over here, and we are within the resulting edifice. This Poe Shrine was built using the bricks and other building materials of the Southern Literary Messenger. So that's, I think, the main reason why this is a special structure. It was built using those pieces of that building that Poe spent so much time in. So here we are. We have been doing these summer Sunday readings for a while now, and for this Sunday I chose Ulalume. Ulalume is, I think, my favorite of Poe's poems. It's a late poem. It's from 1848. Poe died in October of 1849. And we here at the Poe Museum are well aware with the fact that Poe gets associated with Halloween a lot. And we get that. You know, Poe wrote horror stories, and people associate horror stories with Halloween. But the reality is that Poe lived before Halloween as we know it existed, really, at all. Of course, Poe would have known some of its predecessors, Samhain in the Celtic tradition and some other things like that, but the match with Poe and Halloween is really something of a mismatch. However, Ulalume, as you'll see when I read this, is almost like a proto-Halloween poem. It's almost as though Poe knew what was coming, and he knew he would be associated with Halloween, and he wrote this poem. It talks about ghouls and hauntings and a place called Weir, wherever that is. And it is set in late October. He doesn't say it's set on Halloween, but he sort of hints at that. So in October, when I give tours and talk to people about Poe and such, I recommend them to read this poem, because it's the only one that comes close to being a sort of Halloween poem, even though it isn't technically. As someone who reads and appreciates poetry and literature, and someone who reads poetry aloud, Ulalume is especially interesting because it's written in an Anapestic meter. Anapestic means basically unstressed, unstressed, stressed. And the title Ulalume is in Anapestic meter. It's unstressed, unstressed, stressed. Ulalume, Ulalume. And the subtitle of Ulalume is a ballad. So Poe, as many poets do, Poe wrote this thinking about when he and others would read it aloud, and this particular one is closer to a song. It's not a song, but it's closer to a song than some of his other poetry, and he wrote it with that in mind. And it is pretty strictly anapestic, so I think you'll hear that as I read it, and you'll hear that dun-dun, dun-dun-dun all throughout. Hopefully it won't be too obvious, because that would probably ruin it, but the ideas that I would keep in mind as I read it and as you hear it. So, again, Ulalume is from late in his life, 1848. Poe died in Baltimore on October 7th of 1849 at the age of 40. The cause of his death is still a mystery, and I'll be happy to talk about that afterwards. But those of you who have not yet had a chance to go through the museum, I definitely encourage you to do so. And after the reading, I'll be happy to take questions about the poem or Poe or anything else. So here it is, Ulalume about it. The skies, they were ashen and sober. The leaves, they were crisped and sere. The leaves, they were withering and sere. It was night in the lonesome October of my most immemorial year. It was hard by the dim lake of Ober, in the misty mid-region of Weir. It was down by the dank tarn of Ober, in the ghoul-haunted woodland of Weir. Here once through an alley titanic of cypress I roamed with my soul, of cypress with Psyche my soul. These were days when my heart was volcanic as the scoriac rivers that roll, as the lavas that restlessly roll their sulphurous currents down Yannick in the ultimate climbs of the pole, that groan as they roll down Mount Yannick in the realms of the boreal pole. Our talk had been serious and sober, but our thoughts, they were palsied and seared. Our memories were treacherous and seared, for we knew not the month was October, and we marked not the night of the year, night of all nights in the year. We noted not the dim lake of Ober, though once we had journeyed down here, remembered not the dank tarn of Ober, nor the ghoul-haunted woodland of Weir. And now as the night was senescent, and star dials pointed to morn, as the star dials hinted of morn, at the end of our path a liquescent and nebulous luster was born, out of which a miraculous crescent arose with a duplicate horn, Astartes bediamonded crescent, distinct with its duplicate horn. And I said, she is warmer than Diane. She rolls through an ether of sighs. She revels in a region of sighs. She has seen that the tears are not dry on his cheeks where the worm never dies, and has come past the stars of the lion to point us the path to the skies, to the Lethean peace of the skies. Come up in despite of the lion, to shine on us with her bright eyes. Come up through the lair of the lion, with love in her luminous eyes. But Psyche, uplifting her finger, said, sadly, the star I mistrust, her pallor I strangely mistrust. Oh, hasten, oh, let us not linger. Oh, fly, let us fly, for we must. In terror she spoke, letting sink her wings till they trailed in the dust. In agony sobbed, letting sink her plumes till they trailed in the dust, till they sorrowfully trailed in the dust. I replied, this is nothing but dreaming. Let us on by this tremulous light. Let us bathe in this crystalline light. Its Sibylic splendor is beaming with hope and in beauty tonight. See, it flickers up the sky through the night. Ah, we safely may trust to its gleaming, and be sure it will lead us aright. We safely may trust to a gleaming that cannot but guide us aright, since it flickers up to heaven through the night. Thus I pacified Psyche and kissed her, and tempted her out of her gloom, and conquered her scruples and gloom. And we passed to the end of a vista, but were stopped by the door of a tomb, by the door of a legended tomb. And I said, what is written, sweet sister, on the door of this legended tomb? She replied, Ulalume, Ulalume, 'tis the vault of thy lost Ulalume. Then my heart it grew ashen and sober, as the leaves that were crisped and sere, as the leaves that were withering and sere. And I cried, it was surely October, on this very night of last year, that I journeyed down here, that I brought a dread burden down here on this night of all nights in the year. Oh, what demon has tempted me here? Well, I know now this dim lake of Ober, this misty mid-region of Weir. Well, I know now this dank tarn of Ober, in the ghoul-haunted woodland of Weir. Said we then, the two then, can it have been that the woodlandish ghouls, the pitiful, the merciful ghouls, to bar up our way and to ban it, from the secret that lies in these wolds, from the thing that lies hidden in these wolds, have drawn up the specter of a planet from the limbo of lunary souls, this sinfully scintillate planet from the hell of the planetary souls. Thank you very much. We even have black cats cross our path. That will happen. Yeah. Pluto and Edgar are the cats' names. They were born back here behind the shrine about 6 years ago. They have lived here ever since. Edgar is named after Edgar Allan Poe, obviously. Pluto is named after the cat in Poe's great story, The Black Cat. So if you haven't read that, you pretty much have to now. Any questions about anything, about this poem, or the cats, or Poe, or where we are, or anything else?
I'm just curious as to what he's talking about.
Right, it's a pretty mysterious poem, isn't it? I don't dare to try to explain it. It's mysterious, and I think this one was meant to be mysterious. And I think Poe, after the success of The Raven, Poe about a year later wrote an essay in which it's an interesting essay to read, because on the one hand he's clearly very proud of The Raven, and he brags about it, and he tells how it was put together. And again, from a poetic point of view, The Raven is a pretty impressive structure. He uses a very unusual meter. It's a trochaic octameter. A trochee is stressed, unstressed, which is sort of the opposite of what Shakespeare does, for instance. If you've heard of iambic pentameter, a trochaic octameter is, trochee is the opposite of iamb, and then 8 of them rather than 5. And so it's very unusual in poetry. And Poe has all these stanzas that are these perfect blocks of trochaic octameter with one syllable missing deliberately on a couple of the lines in certain places. Even that is deliberate. And so, I mean, if you're a poet looking at The Raven, you have to admire it because of how well it's put together. But at the same time, he tries to demystify it, because The Raven, it made him very famous, and he's proud of it, but he doesn't think it's his very best work, and he feels that his best work is overshadowed by The Raven. So he's saying things like, well, I picked this word because it has an O in it, and I picked this word because it sounds this way. So he's trying to demystify it a little bit. With Ulalume, we don't have anything like that. We don't have an essay he wrote about it, but it does spring from, apparently, someone who asked him to write a poem thinking about how it would sound when spoken aloud, and some sort of poem to help public speakers, apparently. Now, how seriously Poe took that is anyone's guess. But yeah, I wouldn't even dare try to interpret it. I think it's a deliberately mysterious and ambiguous poem. So I think you're welcome to interpret it however you like for yourself. Any other questions? Yes?
What was written contemporaneous? When did he write contemporaneous with this? You said it was his life, so what was going on?
What was going on in his life? Okay, so 1848 was a very weird time in Poe's life, especially the last couple months. In November of 1848, he had been spending a lot of time with a married woman in Lowell, Massachusetts, a woman called Mrs. Nancy Richmond, and he clearly developed strong feelings for her, and she clearly had some kind of affection for him, but she wasn't going to leave her husband, and he gets this promise from her to visit him on his deathbed. And then he gets a letter from another woman, Miss Sarah Helen Whitman of Providence, Rhode Island. And Sarah is a writer herself, and she greatly admires Poe's work, and he reads this letter and seizes upon it and goes up to Providence and proposes marriage to her, and she says no. And then Poe hatches a suicide plot. In Providence, he buys 2 ounces of laudanum, which is opium dissolved in alcohol. He goes to Boston, which is near Lowell, where Nancy Richmond lives, and the plan seems to be this: to take 1 ounce of the laudanum, send Mrs. Richmond a message getting her to rush to his side, and he will kill himself in front of her with the 2nd ounce of laudanum. That's the plan. He gets halfway through it. He gets to Boston, he takes the 1st ounce, then he's too sick to finish the plan. So he's really out of it for the next few days. And then about 2 weeks after this, he and Sarah get engaged. So that's what's going on in Poe's life. That's later. I think he finished Ulalume by this point. But yeah, 1848 was a strange time. He has less than a year to live at this point. The other stories that are out around this time, the Casket of Amontillado is one of the later ones. Hopfrog is after this one. Hopfrog is 1849. Annabel Lee and the Bells are written probably in 1849 also, because they actually get published after his death. So those are some of the pieces that are coming out around the same time as this one.
So can you speak to his death? You alluded to it.
Sure. And first of all, again, please do, if you haven't already seen it, that building now focuses almost exclusively on his death. So Poe's last full day in Richmond was September 26, 1849. He had been living in Fordham, New York. If you know New York, you'll know that Fordham now is part of the Bronx, because the city has grown so much in the past 150 years. Back then, Fordham was a village in the country, 13 miles north of where New York City itself ended. And so Poe was living there, but he was on the road. He was just going up and down the east coast of the United States. He had reestablished contact with his first fiancée, Elmira Royster Shelton, who lived here in Richmond. And I know many of you live here in Richmond, so you'll be familiar with St. John's Church, and you may even know the Shelton House, which is just south of the church. It's still there. There's a plaque out there in front of it. That's where she lived. Poe visited there many times. The plan at the end of his life was to marry her, move into that house, and live happily ever after. So his last day here in Richmond was September 26, 1849. The plan for the next day was for him to go to Philadelphia and see one of his clients, a young writer who's going to pay him money to do some editing work, and then go up to Fordham and move back here. And so he went to see a friend of his, a doctor friend who lived just a couple blocks west of here. And he was talking to the doctor for a while. He left his cane at the doctor's house and then abruptly left the doctor's house with the doctor's cane, went over to Sadler's Restaurant at 15th and Main, had a late meal, then at 4 o'clock the next morning got on a ship heading for Baltimore. And from that time till October 3rd, we know nothing about him, nothing at all. October 3rd, Poe is found at a tavern in Baltimore called Gunner's Hall. He is very drunk. He's wearing clothes that don't fit him or seem to belong to him. He's taken to a hospital in Baltimore. He dies there 4 days later, October 7th, 1849, at the age of 40. The cause of death is listed as inflammation of the brain. That's a deliberately vague term that doctors used when they didn't know what the cause of death was. So there's been a lot of speculation over the years. The theory I usually mention is the cooping theory, which is, first of all, the day Poe was found was Election Day in Baltimore, and taverns were typically used as polling places in the 19th century. Cooping was when people who worked for political candidates running for office would round up people off the streets, out of bars, out of gutters, coop them up, get them drinking, then send them to the polling places to vote repeatedly for their candidates. And the way they do that was each time they came out for voting, put different clothes on and send them back in. So to vote for the same guy, the same place, different clothes. So that may have been what Poe was doing, but there's no proof of it. So even then, even if we knew he was doing that, it's still not a complete cause of death. So I like to quote Charles Baudelaire, a French poet who greatly admired Poe. Baudelaire said, "This death was almost a suicide prepared for a long time." And I think that speaks to Poe's self-destructive nature, especially in those last couple of years. I mean, he did have that weird suicide attempt, and his last couple of years especially were very self-destructive, and I think that's what Baudelaire was getting at. Poe did not use drugs at all, that we can tell, not at all. If anything, the suicide attempt sort of bolsters the proof that Poe was not a recreational drug user, because he clearly didn't know how to handle it. He didn't know how much to take. And aside from that one episode, there was no evidence whatsoever anywhere that Poe used drugs at all. He was a drinker, though. He was what we would today call a binge drinker. So he wasn't a chronic alcoholic. He wasn't drinking all the time every day. It's very clear that he could and did go for months at a time without drinking. But I think he knew that alcohol was dangerous for him, because if he took that first drink, he just, it would get pretty nasty. Yeah, you just couldn't stop. And it'd get really nasty for a few days, a weekend, a week even. Sure, right, and that might be the cause of death, although we don't know. I mean, there's certainly one.
Thank you so much.
Well,